Imagine crossing an endless ocean in a small wooden ship, knowing that behind you was everything you had ever known, and ahead of you was a land you had never seen. In the autumn of 1620, the Mayflower left England carrying more than 100 passengers toward the uncertain shores of North America. Among them were a group of English separatists later known as the Pilgrims, families who had chosen an extraordinary journey in search of a place where they could build a new community. But their voyage was never meant to be easy. The Mayflower was not a comfortable passenger ship. It was a crowded merchant vessel built for carrying cargo, and the Atlantic Ocean offered no guarantee of safety. As the ship moved farther from England, familiar land disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving only waves, wind, and an uncertain future. The passengers faced cramped conditions, limited supplies, cold weather, and the constant threat of violent storms. Yet they continued westward, driven by the hope that somewhere across the Atlantic they could begin again. What they did not know was that their journey would become one of the most famous voyages in American history. Before the Mayflower reached its destination, its passengers would face months of uncertainty, a dangerous Atlantic crossing, and decisions that would shape the story of a new society. Their destination was still far away, but the journey that would help define early America had already begun. As the Mayflower pushed deeper into the Atlantic, the journey became a test of endurance. Days turned into weeks, and the passengers saw nothing but water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Below deck, families lived in cramped conditions while the constant movement of the ship made even simple tasks difficult. Fresh air was limited, supplies had to be carefully preserved, and the cold ocean winds made the wooden vessel feel even more unforgiving. Then the weather began to change. Powerful storms swept across the Atlantic, sending waves crashing against the ship and forcing the passengers to hold on as the Mayflower struggled through the rough sea. The ship creaked under the pressure, and fear spread among those on board. At one point, a major structural problem threatened the vessel itself, raising the possibility that the voyage could end far from land. Yet the crew and passengers refused to abandon their journey. They worked together to keep the ship moving, repairing what they could and continuing westward. For the people aboard the Mayflower, the Atlantic was no longer simply an ocean to cross. It had become an obstacle standing between them and the new life they had imagined. Every passing day brought them closer to their destination, but it also reminded them how uncertain their future remained. After weeks of uncertainty, the Mayflower finally approached the shores of North America. On November 11, 1620, the passengers sighted land near Cape Cod. For many aboard the ship, the moment brought relief, but their journey was not yet over. The place they had reached was not the destination they had originally planned, and the unfamiliar coastline offered no easy path forward. The passengers faced a difficult decision: remain aboard the ship or begin building a new life on unfamiliar ground. Before going ashore, the adult male passengers agreed to create a set of rules for governing their new community. This agreement became known as the Mayflower Compact. It established the idea that the settlers would work together and follow laws created for the common good. It was a remarkable decision for a group of people who had just survived a dangerous Atlantic crossing. Soon, small groups began exploring the surrounding coastline in search of a suitable place to establish their settlement. The landscape was unfamiliar, the weather was growing colder, and the future remained uncertain. Yet after months at sea, the passengers were finally standing on the edge of a continent that would become central to their story. The Mayflower had completed its voyage, but for those who had crossed the Atlantic, the greatest challenge was only beginning. The passengers had finally reached the land they had crossed an ocean to find, but the new world was far from the peaceful beginning they had imagined. As winter approached, the settlers faced freezing temperatures, unfamiliar terrain, and a serious shortage of food and shelter. The Mayflower could no longer be their permanent home, so they began building a settlement on the shore. Timber had to be cut, shelters constructed, and supplies carefully protected from the harsh weather. Every task required cooperation, patience, and strength. The settlers were also entering a region they did not know, a land already inhabited by Native American peoples with their own communities, traditions, and histories. The newcomers could not simply assume that survival would be easy. Their first months demanded difficult choices and constant adaptation. Some settlers became seriously ill as the cold intensified, making the struggle even harder. Yet the community continued working to establish a permanent home. The Mayflower, once their protection against the Atlantic, now stood as a reminder of the journey they had survived. Behind them was England and the dangerous ocean. Ahead was an uncertain future in a land they were only beginning to understand. Their settlement would eventually become known as Plymouth, but its early days were marked not by comfort or certainty, but by endurance. The dream that had brought them across the Atlantic was now being tested by the reality of life in a harsh and unfamiliar environment. The Mayflower Voyage ended when the ship reached the shores of North America, but its story did not end there. The settlers still had to survive their first difficult winter and build a permanent community in an unfamiliar land. Their survival was shaped not only by their own determination, but also by encounters with native peoples who had lived in the region for generations. In the years that followed, relationships between the newcomers and native communities would become complicated, marked by moments of cooperation as well as growing tension and conflict. The settlement at Plymouth eventually became one part of a much larger story that would transform North America. The Mayflower itself returned to England in 1621, but the voyage left a lasting mark on American history. What makes the journey remarkable is not simply that a wooden ship crossed the Atlantic. It is that the people aboard it carried an idea of creating a new community, and then had to confront the difficult reality of making that dream survive. They faced storms, hunger, disease, cold, uncertainty, and an unfamiliar environment, yet they continued forward. Centuries later, the Mayflower remains a symbol of migration, hope, struggle, and the complicated beginnings of a nation. But its legacy also reminds us that American history was never created by one group alone. Long before the ship arrived, native peoples had already built communities, cultures, and histories across the continent. The Mayflower was only one chapter in a much older and far more complex story. And perhaps that is what makes its voyage so powerful. A journey that began across a dark ocean would eventually become part of the story of how America was shaped.